place of birth or of the citizenship. So although all of these definitions seem straightforward, when it comes to the detail, it can get a little bit complicated. So for instance, when looking at the first definition, in the last 3 years, my usual place of residence have been Italy, since I've been doing PhD in Italy and so on. But the fact that I recently moved to Germany, taking the definition of these United Nations, I could be considered as a migrant from Italy who has recently moved to Germany. But following the last definition of the OECD, we all know that, well, clearly I'm a Korean citizen, I am born in Korea, hence I would be considered as a Korean migrant who has recently moved to Germany. When studying these migrants, individuals, let's say, the data that we most rely on are census survey register data. But census data, for instance, in the United States is conducted every 10 years, which means that they're mostly outdated, not to mention that they're costly, time-consuming to collect the data. As we have seen also from the definitions that we went through, there's also inconsistency across, well, data in migration across also different nations because, well, again, the definitions of migrant also slightly differ from country to another. In the worst case of scenario, the data is simply just not available. On the other hand, as countries are more concerned with individuals entering their country more than the individuals leaving the country, often the quality of data on immigration is far behind the standard. Another point that I want to mention is rather specific to the survey, where we have this limitation of having incomplete answers or misunderstanding questions by the respondents, etc. Fortunately, today we're provided with what we call big data, where data comes in various forms that can be images, videos, text, or audio from sources such as Twitter, Facebook, CDR, Code Detail Record, LinkedIn, and more. Most of all, some of them are freely available, such as Twitter data. They provide data that is at very fine level, at a very large scale data. Most importantly, they are continuously generated. Not to mention that there are also information and opinion shared by users on these platforms that can be also used to analyze further interesting research questions that weren't possible using traditional data. So we have decided to exploit this advantage of big data in the study of migration using data science as a new tool. So before I jump into the work, I wanted to really go through the data structure, what we can get from Twitter data, because as I said, in this work, we focus on Twitter data. So when collecting the Twitter data, there are basically two main branches of information that we can obtain. The first is the profile information, like you see here, where it basically prints all the information that you provided in your bio on Twitter. So here, as you can see, you see my name. Don't see my mouse here, but here, as you can see, my name is Jisu KIM. The screen name, you see it's kr/Jisu. Location, as I have given Germany, you can see it's also, you can download the information that I am visiting in Germany. As you can see, the URL as well as description that I have provided on my profile information, that is all provided. Otherwise, verified here, false, it means that those little blue tags that are given when the person is a famous politician, singer, celebrities, etc., that are accounts that are followed by many followers and friends, etc. As I have said, the second branch of information that we can also obtain, which is mainly the most important information that we can get for migration studies, is the following: the geotagged tweets. So for example, here you can see when the tweet is created, hence Monday, yesterday, May 31st, the text of the tweet itself, as well as the exact geolocations by the coordinates, place, and the language in which the tweet was written in, and the hashtags, URLs, and user mentions, etc., that you can obtain from the exact tweets itself. Other than this, I want to also highlight different data collection process that you can go through. So for instance, here we can, as Katharina also kind of mentioned, we can also, well, we can kind of go through tweet objects, meaning that you can go through the streaming collections for specific keywords, e.g. migration, migrants, or otherwise you can go through specific geolocations by defining where you want to download the data from, which can be from place or country level or exact the point radius or the bounding box from the GPS, etc. Otherwise, there's also methodology where you can download the tweets from a specific user by user ID or the username. Another method would be to search for historical tweets for keywords, again using keywords or hashtags such as migration, migrants, etc. Another method is to look at the user object. As I said, we can look at the social network following, collecting information on followers and friends of specific users, etc. Otherwise, there's also another platform such as here followwonk.com, where you can literally search for other people's users using this platform. But I want to mention that these are the methods of data collection process following the version 1 of Twitter API. At the moment, the Twitter API version 2 is available, and I guess some of the things have changed. And again, I'll have to still explore what has been actually updated exactly, but yeah. So, as the title have suggested a lot already, here we are interested in studying the level of cultural integration using hashtags on Twitter. So we were interested in exactly how much do migrants observe culture of their destination society, but also whether they lose connection with their home country. To study cultural integration, traditional studies focus on elements such as language proficiency, marital status, or sometimes is also the role of media. For instance, how much do people how often do they watch local news, for instance? But as culture is a complex concept including many different aspects, here we wanted to provide a novel method to compute what we call home and destination attachment indices using hashtags. So basically, to put the mechanism that we had in our mind in a simple picture is the following. If a migrant in France is engaging in a discussion about Le Pen, this means that he or she is aware of the political situation in France and hence can provide us an indication of how much the migrant knows about the country. On top of this, we also employed the various fourfold model of acculturation to reflect the complexity of integration process, because a migrant, as we know, can either assimilate, integrate, be multicultural, or be segregated from the host country. Basically, all of these different forms of integration can depend upon whether you embrace the host country's culture or you keep the culture of your country of origin. But before I go into further details, I wanted to show you also the data collection process that we went through. So initially, we were provided with a Twitter data from August 2015 to October 2015. And from these data, we selected geo-tagged users in Italy and collected their friends. During this process, the geolocation of these friends enlarged to the worldwide. And to have enough information about these users, we also collected their most recent, 200 most recent tweets. At the end, we had about 260,000 nodes and about 1,200,000 edges. Initially, we began by asking ourselves, how can we identify international migrants on Twitter? In line with the definition that I have went through in the beginning, but also to consider the data structure of Twitter, we define the migrant here as a person who has his or her current residence different from his or her nationality. So following definition, we first identify the country of residence by looking at the tweet locations, and second, identify the nationality of individual users, looking at the user itself, but also his or her network. So as you can see here, to assign the country of residence, we looked at the timeline of geotagged tweets. Here we simply looked at the number of days in which a user tweets from a specific country in the year of 2018, which was the year where most of our tweets were observed. So hence, even if there are undefined geolocations, like in the example here, where there's 25th of February, you see IT/undefined, or otherwise on the 3rd of June, where this person has traveled also to France. What is important here is that the person has been staying in Italy for the majority of time in 2018. On the other hand, for to assign nationality, as I mentioned, we looked at the tweet locations and languages of the user itself and his friends. What we do is essentially this. In this example network, we see 4 nodes, 4 individuals, and we are interested in identifying the nationality of the user U1. So we look at the tweets locations and languages, and we see that the user tweets mostly from Italy, but tweets mostly in Korea, in Korean. And we also see that users' friends, whom are F1, F2, F3, their frequency of their tweet locations and languages on average. And here again, we see that they mostly tweet from Korea and tweet mostly in Korean. So basically for the nationality, we sum up the total scores of each country for both languages and locations, and we obtain the nationality score for the user. And here in this example, we obtain a nationality as Korean. So with the obtained labels for both country of residence and the nationality, we obtain a data set that contains both natives and migrants. By simply looking at the 2 different labels, we can determine whether this person is a migrant or not. So in this example that I have given, we know that this person is a resident in Italy in 2018, and has the nationality of Korean. Hence, it is the Korean migrant living in Italy. Projecting the migration links on core diagram of our data set, we have, as you can see, many data points in the US, followed by Great Britain, Italy, and so on. Italy in our data is relatively well presented in our data because, as you've seen, our first level users were selected among those geolocalized in Italy. In terms of patterns, as you can see, Italy has mostly outgoing links, whereas countries like US and Great Britain has both significant number of in and outgoing links. France and Germany, for instance, has mostly incoming links. So this I haven't mentioned, but to validate our strategy, we performed both internal and external validation. And first, to internally validate our results, we obtained a gold standard data set for both residence and nationality using the profile information. Here, we assume that profile information is credible information as users themselves have declared it. So for the residence, we looked at the profile location as the gold standard data set. For the nationality, we based it on the profile language and tweet location, where the language matches to the country in which the language is being spoken. So in other simple words, if a user's profile language is set to Italian and tweets mostly in Italy, this person would be considered as an Italian. One thing that I want to also mention is that in this process, we excluded the users with the profile language set to English because English may be set by default in many cases, but also because we consider that English doesn't really have any value in inferring a person's nationality. So as you can see here, the gold standard data set, we computed the F1 score, which measures the accuracy of the model on the data set, and it indicates 1 for perfect precision and recall and 0 otherwise. So it shows good accuracy of our predicted data on the gold standard data set with almost 0.86 of F1 score on the residence and 0.99 for the nationality, telling us that there is a good agreement between the two. To further validate our results with the ground truth data, we looked at the Italian immigrants living abroad, and the data we got to validate is the IRA data, which is the Italian register data, and Eurostat. So the figures here display the correlation between our data set and the official statistics. So the first interesting remark that I have noticed is that even between the two official statistics themselves, the numbers don't match completely. The correlation coefficient between the two was 0.91. The second interesting thing, of course, what is important here is that we observed good agreement between our predictions and the official data for the European countries on the top here, where the correlation with the IRA data for European countries were 0.83 and 0.76 for the Eurostat data. For the non-European countries, however, the correlation with IRA data drops to 0.56. Overall, many of the non-European countries were underestimated, we believe, because of the usage of Twitter, which is not as high as in European countries, except for maybe America or Japan. So, having identified the migrants on Twitter, we also looked at the hashtags to determine the country-specific topics. To do so, we define a dictionary where we store probability distribution of hashtag across different countries of natives for each hashtag. And provided with the distribution, we compute the entropy for each hashtag normalized by the number of elements in the dictionary, like in this equation. In order to determine whether a hashtag is a country specific or not, we set an entropy threshold equal to 0.5. This way, we are assigning hashtags with entropy score above the threshold as international topics. Hashtags with entropy score below the threshold would be considered as a country-specific topic, taking the country with the largest value in the distribution as the nationality label. Like in this example that I am showing you here with Salvini, Salvini hashtag has been identified as an Italian hashtag, or Italian specific hashtag. So after this process, we identified hashtags such as Salvini, Immigrazione, Caffè, Trenitalia as Italian specific topics. Other topics such as Trump, EU, immigration, refugee, coffee, and Fiat are identified as international topics. So with the labels of hashtags that we obtained, we now build the two indexes, which are measured by looking at how much you are interested in topics of your country of residence for the destination attachment, and by looking at how much you are interested in topics of your country of origin for the home attachment index. So basically, for both of the indexes, we are looking at the proportion of country-specific hashtags that either belongs to country of residence or the origin. So the overall average for both of the indexes are the following. We have 0.051 on average for the HA index, the home attachment index, and 0.034 for the destination index, the destination index, yeah, DA, which means that in general, migrants stay to a certain degree attached to their country of origin. In this figure, however, you can also see the values with null model analysis, where the hashtags of individual users were randomly redistributed 5 times, essentially to find out whether it can tell us what the index values would have been if the users choose their topics of listening. In other words, whether there was no influence from the country of residence or the nationality. And we saw that the null model analysis, well, the mean of the null model analysis were smaller than the actual values. And to statistically validate that the null model analysis were different from the actual values, we also computed the Wilcoxon and Ks Test, and they both confirmed us that the two distributions were indeed significantly different from each other. Here we computed the correlation between the two indices. Here it shows negative weak relation between the two of negative 0.13, indicating that the more a migrant is attached to his country of origin, the less the migrant is attached to the country of country of the destination, and vice versa. But what I want to highlight is that here we can observe different patterns of individual users leading to different integration types, as mentioned at the beginning. So the red curve here provides us an indication of users' integration type. The distinction between integration and marginalization depends on the length of distance of data point from zero. In other words, when the data point is close to zero, it would be considered as marginalization, and integration is when the data point is further away from zero. Yep, the mouse is not working, so I can't really show it to you, but the data points where they are situated most away from zero would be actually an example of integrated migrant. We also looked at the relationship between our indices with language, as language is considered as the key factor to integration. And we observed that the group that speaks the language integrates more than the other. On the other hand, the group that does not speak the language show higher home attachment level. So our indexes further confirms the significance of the language for the integration of immigrants in the host country. And in addition, it shows the relationship between the language and HA to culture of home country, which has not been much studied in the literature. Continuing with the results here, we are showing the DA and HA indexes levels for Italian immigrants. So in general, we see that the HA level is higher than the DA level for Italian immigrants. In countries like Switzerland, Belgium, and Netherlands are the three countries where Italians are more attached to home. And on the other hand, we see that Italians tend to do pretty well in English-speaking countries, as the DA levels are at highest in United States and UK, for instance. Although DA level is not as high as in English-speaking countries, we see that Italians tend to do relatively well also in Spain. As shown on the figure on the bottom here, you can see that Italian immigrants are mostly skewed towards the integration type of separation. Another case.
Jisu, can I ask you to finish within the next 5 minutes? Is it fine for you?
The last slide, actually.
Okay, perfect.
Okay. So another case study that we looked at is the immigrants in the United States. And we observed different destination and home attachment indices of about 17 groups of immigrants from different country of origin. And overall, we observed that many groups of immigrants in the United States, the DA level is quite high. Immigrants from Canada, of course, has the highest level of DA, followed by Colombian and English immigrants. On the other hand, immigrants from Turkey have the highest home attachment index, followed by Brazilian and Italian immigrants. Again, in the plot on the bottom here, we observe that many of the data points are skewed, mostly integrated and assimilated in general. So to wrap up, we have carried out a cross-country study of cultural integration of international migrants. We have employed Twitter data to overcome limitations of survey, which is the data set that have been mainly used when studying cultural integration. We have reflected the complexity of integration process through the new indexes that we call destination and home attachment indexes, and hashtags have been introduced as a new element to measure cultural integration. So thank you.
Thank you, Jisu. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. Ahmed has already raised his hand, so go ahead, and Jérôme as well. I have a couple of questions myself, but let me give you the floor first. Go ahead, Ahmed.
Thank you. Thank you for your original presentation. In the literature on assimilation integration, at least in economics and so far, we have a view of a dynamic process. I mean, you are never assimilated or integrated immediately. This cannot happen. And when you arrive in a country, it needs time to get attached or to get yourself more distant from your origin country. Mm-hmm. So I am wondering whether in your difference across country, are we mixing something between, okay, we have a picture of difference across country in terms of attachment or home attachment or original attachment, but can we map that with in terms of more dynamics, or with difference across countries in terms of how long people have stayed there? This is very, very important, because what we need in terms of public policy, whatever, is how long it takes for a certain group of countries to reach a certain level of integration or assimilation, or do we stay permanently marginalized? It's a very dynamic process. It's not only about picture, but how we need a movie.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point, because, I mean, one of the very important points to actually take into consideration when studying, integration in general is to consider the length of stay, right? How long have you been living in that country? But this is something that we weren't able to really capture in our data set, because first of all, we're looking at very limited period of time where most of our tweets were actually observed in 2018. So in terms of that, our home and destination attachment indexes are a static measure. But from the experience with the Twitter data, I believe this is something that we can still look into, but it's just that this will require me to download data, continuously, so that I can kind of track these migrants over time and see how much they change. Of course, I think that in a long period of time, at least, these people, or even the Thai immigrants that I've identified as segregated, maybe if they stay in that country long enough, I could identify them as assimilated or integrated at some point of time. But unfortunately, with the data that I have constructed for this one, it's a static process that was only captured.
Thank you.
Great questions.
Thank you. Jérôme, go ahead.
Okay, so I had many questions, but I'm going to focus on one since we're running out of time. I was wondering to what extent Twitter is a self-selected sample of a certain type of migrants, more educated, younger, etc. And this could explain that you have some assimilation, etc. So I would like to know if you have some insight on that.
Well, okay, so this is a very difficult task, because essentially Twitter itself, by the terms and conditions, I guess we're not really allowed to study their demographic specifically, because it's violation of privacy. We can't really go into individual users and study if they're highly educated, do they live in rich areas, or are they men and women, etc. That's not, well, those specific studies of demographic characteristics aren't really allowed using Twitter data. However, looking at other studies that have done this, I guess in United States, I believe was the no, I forgot. But anyways, there's this research institute that has carried out this research to study the characteristics of Twitter users. So they're not really migrants themselves, but anyways, to understand at least the characteristics of who are the Twitter users, mainly in the United States, I've seen that they are mostly high-skilled individuals where their earnings were pretty high, also relative to the general population. If I remember well, also it was mostly women who were active on Twitter in the United States. And yeah, there were a few other characteristics that they were able to capture. But if you're interested, I can pass you the information later.
Okay, thanks. Because there is plenty of implication for your analysis when you compare with real data or the degree of assimilation. This is quite important to mention, I think.
Yeah, of course. Thanks.
Is there any other question? Because otherwise there is a question by Francisco Ro in the chat. Francisco, do you want to ask it yourself or do you want me to?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hello, how are you? Thanks for that interesting presentation. So I was just wondering about the definition of migrants. So could you elaborate a bit on whether you consider at all the duration of a stay or you just compare the nationality of users and the country of residence?
So the strategy to identify migrants using the Twitter data is, we basically stick to the usual definition of a migrant. Let's say we took that the length of stay, as in to be identified as a migrant, you need to be in a new place for at least a year of period. So this is the period speaking that we actually took into account. So if you remember when we looked at the country of residence, to identify country of residence, we looked at pretty much a year of the tweet timeline. And this was the only, let's say, length of stay that we took into account to define a migrant. Otherwise, for the nationality, like you've seen, we've actually took into account the social network more into account, assuming that, the root, let's say, of the country can be reflected through the network. As in, like, even on Twitter, even if I've been in overseas for so many years, I still have majority of the time the Koreans connected on Twitter. So yeah, this was the information that we took into account.
Thank you. Is there any, yes, Domki? Go ahead.
Yes, sorry. I looked for how to raise the hand, but I couldn't find it. So I
okay, so
no, I think of course. Okay, thank you. So of course, Jérôme's question is very important, and this question of selection is actually a big part of Jisu's PhD thesis, but in another chapter. I think here we recall the validation exercise. Of course, it's not perfect, but still there is some okay validation. And also, I think maybe in the interpretation of the result, this is maybe the least we can do at this stage is to, acknowledge for this, of course, and say that given that more the positive selection into Twitter, probably we are capturing an upper bound effect of assimilation, as you pointed out, given that we know that more educated people tend to assimilate more.
I'm going to give the floor to Donkey, but just before, because I had a related question, is there selection into Twitter? This is your point, but is there also selection into geocoding? I mean, those of Twitter which provide the information or where they live might also have a different legal status in their destination country. Is there something here that could, or everybody has to provide information on the location? They live? No. So
So indeed, actually, when using Twitter data, this is another big limitation. Actually, overall, the number of geotagged tweets are not a lot. According to a study, the streaming Twitter data, there's only about 3% that are geolocated. So if you download the Twitter data with the illusion that we're gonna get the big data, like the word suggests, at the end, it's not a big data like you expect, because at the end, I mean, you get the data, but the core data that you really need, which is the geotags, not many of them are actually available, because essentially people can choose whether to, publish their geolocations or not. Yeah.
Thank you. Wedong, Kim, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I just have a quick question regarding the identification of nationality. How to deal with dual citizenship? And then another question, you mentioned about when assigning the nationality, you also rely on some information about social networks. For instance, if you on your tweets you have a lot of Korean posts, you are more likely to be identified as Korean. What about a Chinese citizen, for instance? They don't have much friends tweeting in Chinese because of the censorship. How are you going to deal with this? So that's my question.
Yeah. Okay. So first, to answer the dual nationality, well, I guess this is a bit difficult to capture whether you have a dual nationality, right? But I want to refer to my personal experience, where I've been to a lot of different countries and I've been living there for several years, and they weren't a short period of stay. But in the sense where I've been to different countries, and I feel that my tie to Korea, to some people, may think that my tie back to Korea may have been, let's say, less valuable than at the very beginning, let's say. But this is not true. So the nationality, in the sense, how we define that is, a belonging, let's say. Even if you have dual nationality, I don't know, I'm not sure how a person would feel it exactly, but if I imagine having a citizenship from France and Korea, I would still think of myself as a Korean, because my parents are Koreans. I look like a Korean. Although I speak French, I'm not a French-looking person. So the level of integration or the belonging to France is less weak than to Korea.
So my point is actually, in this identification strategy, are you actually capturing the country of birth, or?
So yeah, country of birth, or technically speaking, I guess citizenship also would actually define that better of what I'm speaking of. And in terms of Chinese, I guess this is another tricky thing that we can't really tell whether we're able to capture their nationality properly, because as you said, I guess on Twitter, Chinese accounts will be really not well represented. So this is a tricky one. But from the experience, I can tell you that Chinese migrants, we weren't able to capture them a lot. It's either because we're missing the country of residence information or the nationality, because there's simply something missing there.
Thank you, Jisu. Dana, do you want to go ahead?
Pardon, oui, bonjour tout le monde. Alors, pardon, Catherine, j'aurais bien aimé vous écouter plus, mais je n'ai pas pu venir avant. Mais j'ai une question pour vous deux. I have a question for both, pardon. Well, what is the future of studying the Twitter corpus? Because more and more it is difficult to approach data from Twitter. That's one of the questions. And second is, what about the migration between migrants on Twitter to other platforms? For example, in eDiaspora, we saw that a lot of bloggers migrate when Twitter comes on the Twitter platform. where go the people who are on Twitter today? On what platform? Where they go? They use what platform today? And about Chinese, because we just give this example, we saw, for example, that the people use Kuku, no, which is a Chinese Twitter platform, and when they come abroad, they use Twitter or other platform to integrate themselves and to make network with people which are not necessarily Chinese. And I think this is a very interesting aspect.
Thank you, Dana. I see that there are new hand raising. Is it related to Dana's point? Because then maybe I could give the floor to Alina and how long before. Hi, Alina. Before Jisu answers.
Salut.
Hello. Yeah, I thought like I'm sure Jisu. Maybe I thought I could answer. I could complete Jisu's answer. I think this question of the future of Twitter is very important and very difficult to answer. I think that a very important thing to mention is this new version of the API, which has has a specific track for research, and with that one can obtain more data. So, for instance, with the free API, you can only download a very limited number of tweets in the history of a user. Now, with this API, you can theoretically go as far beyond as you can, and you can, for instance, estimate the time of arrival of a person in a country. Okay, so once you have a user ID, you can look at the past without too many limits. Okay, so I think that from this point of view, this new API is actually opening the gates for more analysis from our point of view. Of course, it's still, the question of which user is there and how much they geolocalize, depends on the user and not on Twitter. So, and also like all the analysis, like what we saw in the first talk today, those analyses don't look at individual users. So what's different in the two analyses is that if you look at the general population of topics, you still obtain a very large amount of data. Instead, if you want to concentrate on the person and on the migrant, like migrants in the world are, I don't know, 10%, 9, 8, 7% of the population. I don't know what is the general population of the migrants. If you
3.5.
3.5, 4. Okay, I was looking at Italy for, and so like obviously if you try to look for migrants, you're going to get much less data. Okay, so that's a problem, but it's not something that I think jeopardizes the analysis. It's just that we need to be aware of the fact that we're looking at the specific population and a reduced one. So I still think that it's important. It's a nice data source.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Alina. Okay. Jisu, do you want to add something?
I think Alina answered it perfectly.
Thank you. I would like to add something, but it's more a reflection. It does not call for an answer. It's just, if researchers use this data to extract such important information on assimilation and overall assimilation of migrants, I guess governments also do it. And I was wondering where we stand in the reflection of what we know about the use of this kind of data for public policy purposes in terms of migration, etc. If there is any, reflection on both the benefits and the potential cost for the migrants of this kind of analysis, even though, the kind of analysis governments might do using this data.
Well, one thing that I have kind of learned in the Migration Statistics Conference a year ago in Egypt, organized by also OECD, IOM, etc., I can kind of see that, for instance, IOM is very open to discovering big data in different contexts, but especially in migration also. For instance, Marta Ranko, I believe that's her name, from IOM, or Michele Vespe from JRC. They're also two of the people who are very in this area of migration, exploring big data. Otherwise, I'm not sure if OECD explores big data, but I see a few names from OECD, so maybe they can give us some indication of whether they are also interested in developing or exploring big data and study of migration.
Is there anybody who would like to jump in? Otherwise, maybe we can we can come back to this discussion afterwards. Maybe we can have a 5 minutes break, and then we will listen to Jérôme Valette. If we don't mind, I'm going to. Katharina, could you record with QuickTime Player?
It works, but I do think the probably the Zoom version is better. I actually also recorded the audio on the side because I'm not sure if I only captured the screen or also the audio.
Yes, so in that case, I would need to relaunch the meeting. So I'm afraid that we might. It's going to be too complicated. So we keep with QuickTime. Do you think it's
okay?
It's not going to be perfect, but it's just. For scientific purpose, so as far as we can hear, it's what